I am going to kick off the panel now. So my name is Emma Tomalin. I'm Professor of Religion and Public Life at the University of Leeds in the UK. And with Jennifer Eggert, who's waving now, I co-chair the Religion and Development, International Development Study Group at the Development Studies Association. So I'm really happy to welcome you to the third of our three panels on decolonisation, development and faith. And we're running this as we have the other two as a round table. So we have four presenters, and for each of them, I'm going to go to them one by one and address a question or a topic, and they're then going to give their perspective or their answer to that. So we'll go round, we'll have 3 rounds of questions, and then turn over to the audience for some discussion and comments and so on. So each presenter will have about 3 minutes to talk around their answer to the question. I mean, we were going over a little bit yesterday, so don't worry too much. And I will switch my mic on and start staring at you if you've got to about 5 minutes, and try and get you to speed up a little bit. But we've got plenty of time. We've got 1 hour and 3/4 if we need it, so we don't really have to worry about time. So the 3 questions that I'm going to pose to the panel are, first of all, I want to ask, what is your experience in the area of decolonisation, development and faith? Why are you interested in this topic, and why should others be? Secondly, we're going to come to a question around opportunities. So why should we work with faith actors as part of the struggle to decolonise development, and how can faith actors help address global power, asymmetries, racism and colonial legacies? And finally, we want to look at some of the challenges, if indeed we can leave the challenges till the final question. It's difficult not to come to these earlier on. Are faith actors also part of the problem, and what are the barriers to getting them more involved in the struggle to decolonise development, and what are the risks and challenges when working with them? So to the audience, I'd suggest that if you have any questions, either put them in the chat as we go along, and we can begin to build up a conversation and a discussion there, or when we come to the Q&A session in the last half hour or so, I can come to you for your questions then. So let me introduce our first panelists. So the first person I'm going to introduce this morning is Dr. Seb Rumsby, and he is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Warwick. So Seb, what are your thoughts on the first question that we posed to you?
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and looking forward to discussing and chatting with you all. So, yeah, my background is primarily academic. I haven't really got much experience working in the development sector, but my PhD was looking at religious transformation in Vietnam and the kind of intersections with, in this case, Christian conversion, and how that got entangled with ethnic politics, ethnic inequalities, and the kind of desire for development. And this was kind of on the fringes of Vietnamese society. So basically there was this kind of ethnic minority group who were all converting to Christianity. And they were at like the bottom of the ethnic hierarchy, like marginalized, treated with suspicion by the government. And they saw Christianity as a kind of alternative route to development, which was a kind of interesting twist on it. And the more I researched into it, the more issues of colonialism came up. But maybe this is kind of, I hope to bring a kind of slightly different perspective on colonialism, because for the Hmong, which is the name of the ethnic minority group I was researching, the colonialism they're most concerned about is kind of what we call internal colonialism, whereby the ethnic Vietnamese majority are kind of taking over their land and trying to assimilate them, and there's all these kind of struggles. So this kind of introduction of an international religion with all of its own colonial baggage, and then mixing up with a kind of local colonial situation, I found was very interesting and produced all sorts of kind of unexpected kind of alliances and tensions, and that's what I'd like to kind of bring to the roundtable today.
Thanks, Seb. Thanks so much. And actually, I don't think we've explicitly brought up this idea of what you called internal colonialism within the panel so far. We've been focusing on the more obvious east-west, north-south focus of colonialism. So that's something really interesting to add to the conversation as well. So our second panelist, I'm very pleased to introduce, is Amjad Mohammed Salim, who is the Manager for Inclusion, Protection and Engagement at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. So Amjad, what are your thoughts on the first question that we posed?
Great, thanks Emma for inviting me, and thanks for the question. So I'm kind of coming at this more from my personal experience and not necessarily speaking from the Federation's perspective, although there's an issue, there's an interest around decolonization there. But I guess I have several takes to this, right? So the first one is a practical experience of having worked with a faith-based organization in the field and sort of being shut out from certain discussions because we're a faith-based organization or not being provided a seat for that. So for me, it was really interesting to have that experience in terms of how we frame an issue, how we frame a language, who's speaking, what is being said, the images that are being used. I mean, that for me was the first kind of aha moment for me, as in why is this a problem of where I'm coming from in terms of the organization and why is it that someone else can have the same sort of point that I have but be accepted, and what does that say about who's speaking and what is there? And then a realization for me, and this is why I'm really interested in the subject, is that particularly around faith and decolonization is the fact that we're disregarding faith as a lived experience, right? It's 2021 and we're still sort of saying we disregard faith as a lived experience of people, millions of people around the world. And this strikes at the heart for me of the decolonial debate, of a denial of agency, representation, thinking, and power. And so I think that is there. Over the last few years, I guess there's a frustration that I have that decolonization suddenly has become this buzzword, and that we've lumped everything under that, and we're talking about social inclusion, anti-racism, and then social justice, and yes, there's an intersectionality there, but they're not the same, and that we run the risk of looking at things at a superficial level without looking at some of the deeper systemic problems of power. And then lastly, I think a frustration with when we talk about decolonization, who's calling for decolonization? What is the decolonization we're talking about? Issue that I have is many of us who come from previously colonized states or are still living in colonized states, some of us have moved beyond some of those histories of colonialism. On a daily basis, there's issues to do with power, corruption, injustice that our own brand of political elites have created. How are we addressing some of those issues? Why are we being selective about the decolonization that we want to talk around, right? So we talk around certain aspects of decolonization. We don't accept the current, present colonial narratives that are there across the world, and so that's for me is a starting point for what I feel is a complex discussion, that it's not just about paying the price for guilty European consciences, but looking to look at the present to see where there's modern forms of colonialism, and to address that holistically. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Amjad. Thank you. So our third panelist, I'm delighted to introduce, is who we've already seen sitting in his car there, is Manoj Pareshwaran, Parameshwaran, who is a sociologist of religion from Kerala in India. So Manoj, what are your thoughts on this first question?
Thank you for this opportunity. First of all, let me thank all the organizers for that. Now, my experience with development studies and faith-based developmental initiatives, that is mostly academic. I have a very limited, development sector experience per se, but then I was always very curious about the developmental challenges and opportunities in the Indian context. And now, in the global South, especially in India, the developmental infrastructure is still very colonial, and the approach is very top-down approach. That has somehow resulted in keeping the marginalized and the underprivileged in more or less the same position even after 60 years of independence. And the major agenda when it comes to marginalized communities like scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, which are the so-called lower socioeconomic communities in India, the major agenda is to mainstream them rather than looking into their indigenous cultures and their knowledge systems and understanding what they need. And rather doing that, most of the developmental projects and agendas have been focused on what we think they might need. So that's like the major issue that I thought when I was thinking about this, decolonizing developmental studies part. And the representation of this community is very, very normal, and that has actually caused a lot of disproportionate developmental expenditures and not so sincere approaches towards developmental issues in India. And when it comes to faith and development, things get a little more complicated because of the plurality and multicultural ethnic context in India. Kerala, especially where I come from, it is heavily indebted to missionary activities when we were transitioning from colonial to post-coloniality. The education, health, and caste oppression, etc., have been majorly dealt with by the missionary communities, and we have a long history of socio-religious reformers from the indigenous communities. So, if you talk about the Indian context, the nexus between these multiple actors, faith actors, and the developmental challenges and opportunities, that's something that sort of motivated me. That's why I think I am interested, and I think everyone else are quite motivated to look into this. That's my introductory remarks.
Thanks very much, Manoj. Thank you. So the final panelist that I want to introduce this morning is Nadine Bowers-Dutoit from University of Stellenbosch. So Nadine, are you ready to give your answer to this question?
I am, Emma. Cats permitting. Hello. If you hear meow meow,
we can hear you.
My cats have decided to go off at this particular time. So I think it's important for me to say I am an academic, a practical theologian, Christian practical theologian. So I'm not a practitioner, but maybe I could call myself very much practitioner adjacent. And I really want to speak from my own positionality in South Africa. So I was interested to hear Amjad talk about, sometimes issues of racism, anti-racism becoming conflated with decolonization debates. I would say in South Africa, this topic in my locality is really partly arising from the ongoing struggle against racism in South Africa. Because in South Africa, you can't talk about poverty and inequality without talking about the history of racial justice or racial injustice in South Africa, and then the social and economic inequalities that exist even post-apartheid. So for me, in my context, these two are very much intersecting. In South Africa, we have a very large grassroots-based FBO sector. Many of our grassroots nonprofits are faith-based. And at the same time, of course, many of these nonprofits are partly funded by global North donors, and were often in the past, and I would say still largely today, headed by middle-class white expats or white South Africans. And so it's important to talk about issues of whiteness, anti-racism praxis, within this whole debate. And with 27 years post-apartheid, however, like I said, the face of poverty in South Africa is largely Black and female, which, causes me to raise the question, why aren't there more Black people and more Black females at the helm of such organizations, more especially the larger ones that are internationally funded? I think another motivation is I've been teaching and supervising largely practitioners, clergy, as well as NGO practitioners in the faith and development sector for the last 15 years. And of course, the unequal power dynamic between northern donors and so-called southern recipients constantly comes up. The irritation with the kind of white saviorism that they experience at the receiving end of such relationships. And then I think it's important to say that when I say I'm very much practitioner adjacent, I have many, many friends in the FBO sector. And I would say among them, what I would say is the new generation of practitioners of color who are now beginning to serve as directors or CEOs of such FBOs and experience on a daily basis issues of racial bias, cultural misappropriation, undermining of the authority, other microaggressions, both from their own boards, but also from the employees. And when we talk about decolonization, we also have to talk about the way in which those of us who were oppressed minds have also been decolonized and continue to perpetuate these power dynamics in a very strange way, even though we ourselves are part of the oppressed groups. One friend of color who is a clergy woman, but also could be recognized as a development practitioner, formerly having worked for nonprofit organizations, has said actually she's come to despise the notion of community development as it's commonly practiced within the FBO sector in South Africa, because she sees it as simply perpetuating whiteness and notions of dependency rather than Black self-reliance. And so as a result, she actually now prefers to work as an independent faith-based actor in partnership with other practitioners, not necessarily faith-based ones, who claim Black liberation as their aim rather than development. So they're also wanting to problematize the notion of development and how maybe frame the way that some practitioners prefer in South Africa to talk about the notion of liberation as opposed to development. I mean, so basically faith in the colonial project, and in my case, the apartheid project, have been intrinsically tied together, and we know development largely builds on this foundation. So if we want sustainable, just change that takes local realities into account, recognizes the resources of culture in development, engages those power dynamics that we're speaking about, and then I would say the race, class, gender dynamics that come with that, then we really have to decolonize. And I would say, look at what does that mean at the grassroots, particularly within my context. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you so much, Nadine. Thank you. So I'm now going to move on to our second question, which is looking at opportunities. So why should we work with faith actors as part of the struggle to decolonize development? How can they help address global power asymmetries, racism, and colonial legacies? So I'm going to come to the panelists in a different order now. This time I'm going to start, if it's okay with you, Amjad.
Yeah, thanks, Emma.
Great.
Great. I mean, I'm going to start this with what for me has always been an anecdote of why faith matters and what the role of faith organization is in that space. And I remember in the fields of Sri Lanka being, when the height of the problems, and I was told off by the president of the Methodist Church to kind of say, the UNGOs, you know, you come, and then when there's a slight sense of security, you just leave, because you have to, and you know, we as the church, we will be there, we will walk with our community. And that for me has always been the thing that reminds me of that, why faith engagement with faith communities is extremely important, because you know, they are part of the community, they are the community, they are the local community. And so, you know, if you take that out, then, you know, what right are you to have to engage with that? But I really want to pick up on what Nadine was talking about, and two things that really came up with this concept of liberation, which I think is really important, which speaks to the concept of an alternative approach to thinking about this. Because absolutely, you know, I think, you know, it's easy to forget that the global aid and development industry can be considered, or is considered, or is the grandchild of the colonial civilizing mission, right? That comes to kind of say that with the pedagogy that, you know, those people who are brown and black skinned do not have the agency and power to kind of help themselves, so we have to come and help them. And I think that has been there, and I think that is something that we need to acknowledge. So the question is, how do we, you know, what do we do to kind of challenge that? And of course, faith has also been part of the civilizing mission, and I think, you know, Seb's points from what he was talking about in terms of that type of transformation, I think is part of that. But equally, if we look at many of our countries, many of us who come from those countries that were colonized or in the post-colonial, faith also played a great role in challenging the colonial powers, right? But not maybe necessarily the Abrahamic faiths, but I think more of the local faith traditions, whether there were monks or chieftains or whatever. So I think that there's an opportunity there for us to you know, utilize that space, provide an alternative thinking. For me as well, the secularization debate for me is actually an element of colonization, right? Because it ignores the lived experience of people. I mean, religion matters for people on the ground, and for you to come and say that we don't want faith to kind of influence or have that, for me is itself a sort of a colonial approach to kind of say, well, we don't really think that what matters for your community in your life, that, you know, religion belongs in the private sphere in Europe, and so it should be, you know, it should be for the rest of you. I think is really part of that challenge. And so I think there are opportunities there. I mean, from my perspective, this alternative paradigm of thinking, an approach that interrogates localization, that provides agency to the local, that has a pedagogy of liberation and freedom. I think all of those things can be created within that safe space for that. But it's also, I think, worth realizing that it's also a two-way process, right? So it's not just coming from a Eurocentric perspective, it's also what is required from the ground and how we approach it. And I think that's where I would sort of put forward that those are the opportunities that are there. And faith communities, and I think we all sort of know the value of faith community, but faith communities perhaps offers a different space to have that conversation. And I think yesterday we were talking about these different spaces that faith communities can provide, and I think that's the opportunity that is there to rethink differently if we are able to get out of that space. But unfortunately, sometimes faith-based organizations as well fall victim to the same sort of process, because we all are dependent on donors and funding and all of those things, and so we end up trying to sort of address that. And I'll stop there because I don't want to get into the challenges yet. But that's I hope that's at least some more food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And again, I think this is something that hasn't come up yet in the discussions, is this idea of secularism being an element of colonialism. It's absolutely fundamental to sort of rethink how we consider the place of religion and the kind of importance that we give to religion in people's lives. So thank you for that, Amjad. So I'm going to come to Seb next, if that's okay. So what are the opportunities involved in engaging with faith actors around decolonising development?
Yeah, again, so I'm all going to be basing it on kind of my research, which is based in Vietnam, but I think is also going to be very much applicable to kind of the Chinese experience of development and faith and colonialism as well. So this is kind of like, I often find when I'm talking about religion and development, a lot of the research is based in South Asia, Africa, Latin America, and there's a very different dynamics going on in East Asia, and especially with the kind of socialist states. So when I'm talking like with these kind of Christian converts in upland Vietnam, you know, again, like the idea, well, for a start, Christianity is a very new religion for them. It's only kind of been introduced in the last 30, 40 years. So there's no notion of a kind of colonial legacy, that most people are quite unaware of that. And then when like, I really kind of agreed with what Amjad was saying about when we're talking about decolonization, then what do we mean, and who's calling for it? And again, so for this ethnic minority group, the kind of experience of a kind of Vietnamese majority government development agenda, which is kind of encouraging Vietnamese lowlanders to immigrate into their kind of indigenous lands and usually kind of take the land from them, as well as these kind of state-sponsored drives for assimilation to a kind of civilized Vietnamese thing, which again portrays ethnic minority cultures as backwards. So this is like the colonialism that they're experiencing firsthand. And Christianity, surprisingly, is kind of used as this kind of counter, where basically from the ethnic minorities are being kind of forced to modernize one way or another. And you can either go down like the Vietnamese state route or Chinese state route, or for some people, they found like Christianity is this kind of alternative vehicle where they can still access the kind of benefits of modernity, if you like, and being part of this international community, but without having to assimilate to the kind of immediate kind of threat, if you like. So, I mean, I think, and the other thing to say about this group is that faith-based development organizations have not really been part of this story. If you want to be an NGO in Vietnam, you have to work with the government, otherwise you're not allowed in. And Christian organizations which are in that boat are not allowed to be religious at all. They just have to basically give their money to the government, and the government will kind of organize grassroots projects here and there. So the kind of organizations that have been inputting to the ethnic minority group are like missionary organizations who have a very different agenda to development, faith-based development organizations, and are often not very critical about the history of Christianity, and perpetuate some of these kind of problematic views of, well, it all gets mixed up as well with like capitalism versus communism in these countries. So I was speaking to this Hmong pastor who was saying, oh, the problem with Vietnam is that they didn't, compare it to Korea, or South Korea anyway. The South Koreans became Christians, and then they developed, and they're one of the richest countries in the world. Then look at North Korea or Vietnam, they chose the communist route, and look how poor they are. And so these kind of debates get kind of mixed up with all sorts of other political and economic things. But the interesting thing is, like, Christianity can be kind of a form of empowerment, even in its kind of evangelical, uncritical form, by kind of essentially acting as a counterweight to state socialism. So, for example, I'm just kind of reaching out a bit more broadly, but if you think about the Hong Kong protests, and a lot of the student protests were actually led by Christians. That wasn't reported widely, but Joshua Wong and all of their crew, they're all Christians. They've got massive support from right-wing evangelical American, lobbying, and even, Donald Trump's hardline stance towards China is, you know, problematic for all sorts of reasons. But from like the Asian Christian perspective, this was seen as a quite a positive thing to kind of counteract against the kind of growing threat of China. So I think there are opportunities to work with faith actors as part of the struggle to address global power asymmetries. But then it gets very messy when you actually try and get down to the basics, and you end up getting Vietnamese Christians often being very pro right-wing Republican. You know, not that they can vote, but they certainly seem to think that that's the way forward. So I guess I'm just opening up a can of worms here, because I think we don't want to just talk about our kind of like, you know, liberal faith organizations who are all kind of clued up on these kind of things, but there's a whole world of other religious organizations and actors at work in development, in global power asymmetries, who are not on the same page of it as perhaps we would be. And it's important to kind of engage with them as well, perhaps in a kind of strategic way where you can see alliances that could be useful for local empowerment, but there's risks to that as well, as you can imagine. I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Seb. A lot to think about there, and lots of points that we haven't yet really discussed in the roundtables. I didn't think we'd get to the third day and still be making new points. Maybe that was naive of me, but thanks very much. So the next person I'm going to come to is Nadine. Are you ready to give your views on this issue of opportunities?
Yes, Emma. So I think, like much of the global South Africa is a very religious society. Over 80% of people identify as religion. So it's expected that religion is a role player in civil society. And of course, we saw that both in bad religion and good religion during colonialism and apartheid, as religion as being both liberative but also oppressive. So that sort of double legacy, if you will. And most, like I already said, most nonprofit organizations, or many nonprofit organizations in South Africa, are faith-based. And in one of my recent small empirical study undertaken in the Western Cape Province, where I live, with around 80 Christian organizations, I would say that they are unashamedly faith-based. Now, that could also be problematized with some of the ways that they integrate faith. You know, definitely proselytization is part of that. But it was interesting to me. I remember interviewing one faith-based leader, and she said that to disavow the faith part of the organization, a northern donor, for example, had asked them to do that and said, listen, you'll get more funding if you disavow your Christian identity. She said that would be like disavowing my mother. I would be disowning my mother if I did this. And I believe, you know, that kind of behavior is at grassroots a way, I think, of resisting power hierarchies in a very maybe small way. Maybe you could say it's a limited way, but it was very interesting for me to see that faith-based organizations in Cape Town, at least, quite a number of them said they would rather lose northern or secular donor funding than part with their faith identity, at least within in my own context. I think one of the things, even though I'm a Christian theologian, it's very obvious to me in the South African sector that, for example, Gift of the Givers, which is an Islamic relief organization, is the biggest FBO in the country, and is called upon whenever there is a national disaster to step in. Where government is not acting responsibly and quickly, Gift of the Givers will often be the first one to respond in a very effective, strategic way. And then we also have networks of Christian faith-based organizations. So during COVID, we saw the mass mobilization of faith-based organizations, both non-profits and congregations, and of course, other faith actors mobilizing in the same way, in ways that are more trusted by civil society sometimes than the government, which is seen as corrupt. So monies would rather be directed via the FBO sector than via the government in terms of COVID relief. I also think the notion of indigenous spirituality, sometimes we talk about ATR, African traditional religions. Of course, the intersection between religion and culture is also very complex and nuanced. Where the one ends and the other one starts is not always very easy to distinguish. But I think, you know, indigenous religions or cultures offer us a resource for decolonizing our minds. And I think that's one of the unexplored areas in terms of the decolonization debate. So for us to not just focus on the mainline religions in South Africa, which are very dominant, but also on ATR, which is often identified as culture rather than religion within our particular context. I think another opportunity is that, I think we've already said this over the past couple of days, that, you know, all faith traditions basically have notions of justice and human dignity at the core of their teachings and their sacred texts. And I've already noted liberation theology in South Africa, Black theology has come to the fore as a possible resource for, you know, dismantling racism, neocolonialism. It's a kind of a lens. But in a more pragmatic way, things such as contextual Bible study, coming out of course, the Christian faith tradition, are being used at grassroots for means of liberation and different ways of looking at the text in terms of promoting empowerment, self-reliance, and challenging issues of injustice, inequality, you know, gender issues, etc., at grassroots. So there are many things I can talk about, but just what comes to mind for now.
Wonderful, thanks so much, Nadine, thank you. So in this final, the final panelist in this second round, I want to come to is Manoj. Are you ready to give your views on this question?
Yes.
Thank
yes.
you.
So when we think about decolonizing faith and development, and when we think about alternative ideas, alternative thinking towards development, I think religion provides a major, you know, source for that. And before that, we should actually look at what is to be decolonized, from where it should be decolonized, and what can be the alternative approaches towards developmental thinking and practice. How can we think about, you know, decolonizing academia and educational institutions which sort of perpetuate colonial knowledge systems, etc. And coming from there, like I said earlier, India being predominantly, I'll be talking from India and Indian context and Indian perspective, because that's where I have my experience. So India being home for multiple faiths, all these multiple faiths and religious traditions, like Nadine said, brings with themselves an indigenous traditions of values systems and their own ideas of development and human justice, etc. So that's one major source of thought, decolonizing developmental thought. For example, the work that I'm expecting to embark on, that is on a particular faith-based organization called Mata Amritanandamayi Mission. Mata Amritanandamayi is a spiritual Hindu spiritual leader from Kerala. And in her own discourses, there are multiple mentions about an alternative idea of modernity that the East can offer for the West, for to be a little more specific to the problems created by the Western developmental thinking and systems, especially colonization. So she talks about how to integrate, spiritual dimensions to development in addition to the materiality. She clearly says that without material development, it is very difficult. But at the same time, when you include a spiritual dimension to it, it becomes more wholesome, and it becomes more, it produces more happy individuals and systems. So similarly, the entire idea of this particular faith-based organization, it thrives on the idea of selfless service, seva, which is deeply rooted in the Indian tradition, Hindu tradition. This seva, the entire organization is functioning based on seva of believers and volunteers and members of the organization, which can actually motivate other similar organizations to work in the same form. And especially because it actually works on the ground, it is sort of informed by local needs and by interaction with the local communities. So that becomes a little more easier to address their concerns, and it can really offer some alternative thoughts to materially driven economic progress oriented developmental thinking. That can be one major way in which we can look at how this particular faith-based organization can address global issues and inequalities, etc. And to give you another example, one of the major targets of sustainable developmental goals, which is climate change and how we can reclaim environmental integrity, etc. This faith leader actually replaces and reimagines the modality of Hindu systems of festivals. There is a festival called Vishu, wherein the family members gift money to fellow family members, and she is asking the members to along with the money, gift another plant, gift or try to plant another tree, and that's sort of getting included into a religious system, a religious tradition. So it's actually a very interesting combination of environmental thought and the religious tradition. So similarly, there are many such alternative forms which can inform post-developmental perspectives here that can come from the multiple faith traditions in India and elsewhere. So I think that's where the opportunity lies. But these 8 out of 10 Indians believe in a religion, and they think that that is most important in their personal lives. So that sheer reach of faith in human lives is one major opportunity, and at the same time, we have multiple faith groups working. So that's where I think I find the opportunities to, in towards the approaches. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Manoj. Thank you. Some really, really excellent points there. Okay, so we're coming now to our third question. So we'll do another round with the panelists. And the third area we wanted the panelists to address is around challenges. So are faith actors also part of the problem? What are barriers to getting them more involved in the struggle to decolonize development? And what are the risks and challenges when working with them? So I'm going to mix up the order again. Nadine, are you okay to start this time? Excellent, thank you.
I'm fine to start, thanks, Eva. So, part of most of my training is with faith actors, so with clergy and then with FBO leaders. And one of the biggest challenges has been the fact that faith traditions can be liberative, but as I said, can also be oppressive and fundamentalistic. I think, Seb, you used a little bit of that terminology. And therefore, one of the things that they often do is demonize anything that's seen as traditional or indigenous culture. And considering I mentioned that as a resource, this is actually quite a hindrance. So a part of that lies within a kind of fundamentalistic evangelical theology, and I'll say I'm a Pentecostal, so I fall into that sinful camp, but don't subscribe to that notion. But, you know, particularly the kind of imperialist sort of westernized Christianity, prosperity theology, American fundamentalism that's taken root on our continent. So when you use the word decolonization, you may risk alienating particularly clergy, church leaders. It's more especially those who are not trained in contextual theology. One of the ways to address that is, I think, with training. And I spoke about, you know, how the biblical text, how sacred texts could be used in liberating ways. And so it's very important to engage their hermeneutical lenses. How are they interpreting the text? Because the interpretation of the text or their misinterpretation of the text leads to issues such as GBV. We've seen lots of studies on that. So for me, you know, addressing hermeneutics, interpretation of sacred text is one of the ways, and hermeneutics or interpretation of text is one of the key barriers. And in terms of engaging them, I've seen in my own praxis. So there is a course that I teach with clergy, a master's course, and they initially think that I'm going to talk about community development because I'm the theology and development lecturer, and I do not. All I basically do in that course, together with a fellow clergy person, is deconstruct notions of power, race, and inequality in South Africa, so as to equip them and give them the correct lenses. Correct is, of course, a relative term, but give them informed lenses in order to engage in a decolonized way. I never use the word decolonization, and we never start the course with me saying things about power or race across, but it becomes very evident very quickly to them. And it causes a great deal of discomfort and disorientation. But from some of the reporting of the classes afterwards, they said that was the best thing because you gave us a tool to think differently or look at the South African society through different lenses. So in my context, you have to confront intersections of inequality, poverty, and race in South Africa. Those are hard conversations to have with faith actors, also more especially getting white faith actors to acknowledge the ways in which apartheid and colonialism, as taught by the church during these eras, has actually resulted in the impoverishment of the masses. And part of that discussion in South Africa is the restorative justice discussion, although Amjad, I agree, that's not the whole of the discussion, right? But that's definitely an intersection discussion. And another aspect of it, of course, is the whole theological dualism where political issues are not viewed as part of the spiritual realm. So if you have a very fundamentalistic evangelical spirituality, then, you know, these are political issues, and the whole notion of decolonization and everything that comes together with it is political, and the church's role is spiritual. Yet, of course, we know that the very roots of apartheid and colonialism are spiritual in and of themselves. So these are some of the tensions in my own context. And I speak, apologize, I speak very much, maybe I'm not so apologetic about it. I'm speaking very much out of my own positionality in South Africa, but listening with great interest to all of your perspectives as well.
Thank you, Nadine. Thanks very much. So the second panelist I'm going to come to this time is Amjad. Are you ready to give your views on this question?
Yeah, so thank you. And I think just what Nadine said, I think was really what I think I was also trying to say. There's an opportunity, just starting from the opportunity perspective again. I think it's there that alternative paradigm, or that to think differently, to view things differently, to kind of look at the context differently. I think it's something that where I feel it's not been exposed, it's not been developed very, very much so. And I think, I work for a Muslim faith organization, and I always used to be very frustrated that we had our own approaches to sort of development and charity, and we never exploited it in terms of its fullness. We only used it to kind of get funding in because we sort of realized Muslims have to give charity, but we never sort of looked at it in terms of what is alternative that we can give to the model that is out there. And I think there's a gap there that I think that we need to look at. Seb talked about things being messy. And I think that's the challenge of working with the faith-based organization. And that's perhaps why people don't want to engage with the faith-based organization, because you're not just getting the physical aspect, you're actually getting a spiritual aspect which no one can quantify or put a finger on it, right? Like what drives a faith-based person, or what drives someone who's kind of looking at, there's something else and you can't explain it, but it's there. And it's very hard to kind of put that in. So I think that is part of the problem in terms of that aspect. And of course, as we've also heard that, faith communities are not a panacea, right? They come with their own challenges. So I think that's, I guess, the start of the conversation. But equally, we know that for many, and if we talk about faith-based organizations, particularly coming from Western Europe or the global North, all of them come with this Eurocentric knowledge system, right? And I think that is something that we need to break to kind of see, okay, who's being spoken at, who's getting a vote, what are the images that we're using, how are we guilty? And I think many of us who work there, we are also guilty of perpetuating an image of who the needy person is, because we fundraise, right? We do that. Many of us who are diaspora members who are living in having heritage from global South but living in the global North, we also perpetuate that, right? We also sort of say, well, we've come because our parents had to move for various reasons, or we moved for various reasons. We also perpetuate an image. I think that there are those challenges there. Often, I think, particularly in the current system, faith-based organizations, one of the challenges that they're very reluctant to kind of talk around their faith as well, right? They will sort of say, yes, we're faith, but we adhere to the Red Crescent code of conduct, or we're impartial, where we adhere to the humanitarian principles. So they go out of their way to put forward a secular image because they don't want to be painted in that corner. I think these are all challenges that I have in terms of addressing that. And maybe just to kind of finish off a little bit is to sort of say that we do also have a challenge is when we talk about humanitarianism and development, there is a challenge in the sense that these are also life-saving, and these are also about human connection, human solidarity. So I think that there's a danger of negating all of that when we talk about if we talk about decolonizing development, humanitarian action. I often find people, it's not a black or white situation, let me put it that way, right? It's a complex. Humanitarianism and development is it's complex and contradictory system, and we can't sort of say that we do one without the other. So I mean, from my perspective, I think that that we just need to have that better nuanced understanding. I mean, I work for the Red Cross, and the Red Cross's history is not necessarily colonial. It was domestic. It was set up when Europe was fighting each other, and it was set up in that sense to kind of look at how within Europe they would deal with the injured. But within the history of the Red Cross, you also have the influence of the Japanese and the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century as expressions of humanitarian response. So how is that notion of humanitarian and development that comes from not from a Eurocentric perspective, but from the Ottomans and Japanese and the Chinese, as said, how are we looking at that perspective there? So I think that perhaps when we look at the inherent contradictions, and the notion of colonialism, it's just maybe, I guess, a better way for us to shine a lens on our own project. So, I mean, those are some of the challenges that I see that are there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Amjad. Thank you. So I'm now going to turn to Manoj. I'm keeping people on their toes, you see. You can't guess my method. Manoj, are you ready to go?
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
My ideas go quite connected to Amjad's and Nadeem's perspectives. The fact that we have we have a number of religions as an opportunity is also a challenge, because India is actually a Hindu majoritarian nation. Around 80% of Indians are Hindus, and the rest are minority religions, and and we'll have to accept the fact that there is hostility between these religious groups, and there's a presence of multiple extremist groups within each of these religious communities, and keeping a check on these groups and avoiding to tread on their trajectory is a very difficult task to do when we engage with faith-based organizations and faith actors. And the other thing that I was thinking is the rise of Hindutva, a religious nationalist ideology based in Hinduism, which actually is also in power in India. With the rise of Hindutva, in that sense, there is actually a threat to minority communities and also minority, faith-based organizations to work in India. And most of the times, or I can't say most of the times, many a times, the state also fails to protect these minority organizations and faith-based organizations working in the development industry. So when you valorize faith-based organizations, and when you over depend on religious traditions source for developmental thinking, it also comes with and the problems that are underlying within their own religious systems. For example, caste is a major issue within Hinduism, hindering development for scheduled castes and tribes. If you actually embrace Hindu traditional system of knowledge, casteism is embedded within. So you will have to find a way to move around the potential benefits that we can gain from local traditional knowledge systems and religious traditions, and at the same time we should be very vigilant to avoid certain things which are the inherent contradictions within itself when you talk about development for that matter. And so the point is to when you talk about depending on local traditions and cultures and decolonizing development, like Amjad said, we should not fall into the trap of playing to the ethno-nationalist agenda and ethno-nationalist programs. So that way we will have to handle another internal colonizer in terms of addressing developmental issues. And the another fact that I was thinking is about the state's control over faith-based organizations and state's control over especially minority organizations who are engaged in the developmental sector. The recent Foreign Contribution Regulation Act in India sort of prohibits a number of minority religious organizations from working freely, especially during the COVID situations. Their work was terribly affected. There is also a tendency to intimidate them with threats of proselytism and threats of forced conversion, etc. It also sort of restricts the foreign aid that these organizations might have been getting. So the state's intervention in this context in contemporary India, you will have to look at it in the context of rising Hindutva, like which I mentioned earlier. So there's a high number of hate crimes against other minority religions, which are sort of sponsored also by local tradition, religious traditions as well. So when we talk about decolonizing, we cannot also negate the fact that we are also getting a lot of aid from other humanitarian organizations from the West, like Amjad said. So it should be a very careful, combination of what to take and what to reject. So the basic, it's a maze of how to deal with the state, how to deal with the local traditions, and also how to deal with the already existing developmental agendas. Thank you, Amma.
Thanks so much, Manoj. So I'm now going to turn to our fourth panelist to address this final question. So Seb, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm really enjoying this conversation, and
it's great, isn't it?
Yeah. As an aside, when Amjad was talking about how like working with religious groups can be messy, and that's why a lot of like the development sector just kind of doesn't want to do it. It really reminded me of this really fascinating piece written by Philip Fontaine, which is in an edited volume edited by our very own Emma. And I found the link for it, and it's great. It talks about religion being seen as this kind of polluting threat to the kind of apparently pure motives of the development industry, and that's why it's seen as so problematic. But we all know in real life is messy, and you can't just separate things out into nice neat boxes like this is the economic and this is the social and this is the political. It doesn't work like that. But that's just something to think about, why things are messy and everything. But yeah, going to the question about what are the challenges or barriers of getting faith actors involved in the kind of decolonial agenda. Again, in my context, remember, I'm talking about decolonialism in terms of this kind of internal colonialism, where we have a kind of ethnic majority development, assimilation / migration kind of complex, which evangelical Christianity has been seen as a kind of counter to, or at least a kind of alternative resource to kind of challenge oppression, or at least find another route to modernity. So the problems with this, absolutely, Nadine's hit a few of them on the head. And this is a very much a fundamentalist evangelical form of Christianity that is kind of popular in Vietnam in general, and I suspect in China as well. A fundamentalist spirituality tends to be quite intolerant of indigenous culture and often other religions. But in the Vietnam context, it is a bit different, because all different religions have this kind of shared experience of government persecution or discrimination. So often you have like Christians going to the same conference as like Buddhist monks and other kind of religious minorities, and finding out, oh, we've got more in common than we thought we did and everything. So that's quite nice, kind of shared experience, even though it's found out the hard way. What Nadine said about fundamentalist spirituality being quite apolitical, again, in Vietnam context, it's different, because if you sign up to be a kind of fundamentalist evangelical Christian, the communist government is seen as a problem, and so immediately you're kind of thrust into this political side, which tends to be quite critical of the government, very aware of government corruption. A lot of the kind of prominent advocates for a multi-party democracy in Vietnam are Christian lawyers or Buddhist monks and things like that. So it's not apolitical. So that's not such a big problem. I'd say perhaps the biggest problem of kind of evangelical Christian development in Vietnam is that it has a very kind of capitalist view of development, where the solution is we just need to modernize, we need to constantly move forward, we need to, you know, engage in markets, and that's the problem. If the government just let all the markets go free, then we wouldn't be so poor, then we could really develop, and it's quite it's quite limited, and it's kind of very much caught up in the kind of what Tanya Murray-Lee calls the will to improve. This, like, there's something wrong with us, we need to get better, we need to get richer, we need to do this. And Christianity seems to have no kind of counter to that, or even, like, you know, you don't necessarily have to, that, you know, that will to improve is not a bad thing in and of itself, but it's not the whole story, right? And that's where, like, the kind of jettison of indigenous culture is a problem, because indigenous culture is much less focused on progress and more about, you know, continuity and harmony with nature and things, and that's what is kind of lacking in the kind of Vietnamese evangelical Christian context, from my perspective as an outsider. And I don't want to speak on behalf of all these people. We need to, next time I'll try and invite someone along to join the debate. I really can't believe I didn't think of that earlier. But anyway, that's, I think, what I've got to say for now. But yeah, there's a lot of, I think there's also a lot of opportunities in working even with evangelical actors, especially in the kind of East Asian context, but also challenges.
Thanks. A wonderful end to the round of questions. Thanks, Seb. And it's wonderful to see how much enthusiasm this topic has generated amongst all of the panelists that we've had. So thank you so much. So now I think we've got about half an hour left, and I'd like to do two things. So turn back to the panelists and say, you know, please do come in with any further points, any further additions to the conversation that you'd like to make. We finished with the questions now, but also to invite our audience to raise their hands or to put their questions into the chat. And we can also bring you into the conversation as well. So the floor is open to the panelists and also to the audience as well.
Oh, sorry, no.
There's a hand, and we'll come back to you next, Seb. It's Kamna Patel. Hi, Kamna, would you like to make your point? Hi, nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Thank you to all the panelists. This is such a really invigorating topic, so I'm grateful to you all for your insights. I had a more, I don't know, a point that I would love to get your insights on, because it's something that I'm thinking through, and I wonder, yeah, I'm at the beginning of my journey where I think you're much further along in it, in this kind of thinking. Just making a slight separation between faith-based organizations as this structure that exists within the development sector and this idea of spirituality that you were speaking about earlier. I wonder what opportunities you think might exist in tapping into these ideas of the spiritual, the ethereal, the things that are in a sixth sense in some way, and the possibilities of epistemic plurality that can then be mobilized in some kind of an operational way in the practices of faith-based organizations. Which may or may not be within the structures of the development industry. So this idea of really being able to position oneself to relearn, to know in a different form, tapping into the spiritual.
Thanks, Kamna. I think this is one of the most crucial questions underpinning the whole debate in this area, and one that I constantly find myself having absolutely no solutions to. So I'd be really interested to hear from the panelists or from anyone else in the audience that could shed some light on this particular conundrum. Thank you. Nadine.
So Eva, I can respond to this, but again, from a very limited context. So what I've observed, Kamna, from a very much from a Christian perspective, right? And so I don't know how it would play out in other religious contexts, but certainly one of the faith-based organizations, I'm on their board. And so I've had the opportunity to observe some of their practices, and I've also studied them. And they very much place prayer as a kind of meditative practice before they do any work. So it's not just about saying, oh, we pray and it's part of our program. They integrate things like spiritual retreats, something they would call spiritual direction, of course, in their case, you know, by a Christian practitioner. And they very much would talk about, but this is very Christianese, you know, the guiding of the Holy Spirit in the way that they engage conversations. And it's interesting because this organization was birthed, say, from an evangelical hotbed, if you will, but a more liberal evangelical, if you can call it that, positioning. And so they integrate parts of very evangelical spirituality and sort of deep acknowledgement of their faith and prayer, and the role of what they would call the Holy Spirit in discerning. So they even have developed a process which they call corporate listening and discernment. It's a whole fascinating process where they use the text, the biblical text, the context, and they engage each other in this, which used to be a 5-day process of trying to hear what God is saying to them as an organization in their development practice on the ground. Now, it all sounds very ethereal, but I've seen the way that that's actually led to strategic plans, and I've watched how it plays out in their relationships. And this particular organization is very much social justice based, so also working across the city with social justice movements for equality of housing, service delivery, and those are not necessarily religious actors, right? But their own praxis is very much driven by this kind of spirituality, which may be frowned upon from the outside, but which they are unashamed about. And they do not necessarily take it into their engagements with other actors who are non-faith actors, but they root themselves in these specific kinds of practices. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's just a perspective.
Kamna, can I just check that, are you the Kamna Patel who wrote the article in Third World Quarterly? Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to put a link to this here because I think it will be interesting to, because we've not met before, so apologies. People here, an article called Race and a Decolonial Turn in Development Studies, which was published in Third World Quarterly next year. So I will put a link to that in the chat.
That's kind. Thank you.
Thanks, Kamna. Thank you.
Plug my own work, but
yeah. No, well, I'm happy to do it for you. Thank you.
Emma, maybe just to kind of come on to what Kamna was saying and sort of based on, I think that there's a tension there, particularly for some of the more professional faith-based organizations within the development humanitarian space, right? Where there's a tension between trying to remain sort of true to your values as a faith-based organization and professional, but not seeming to be too spiritual, because that may alienate certain donors and certain this and so you have this inevitable tension where, as I was trying to say before, that faith-based organizations often try and go out of their way to claim they're adhering to the fundamental principles, they're adhering to humanitarian principles, and that they're not faith, because otherwise people don't want to deal with them. Donors don't want to deal with them. And I think that's the tension where, in terms of the explicit kind of relationship with spirituality, although individuals within that may have their own expressions of spirituality. So I think that's a tension. Interestingly enough, now where I sit, where it's not necessarily within a faith-based organization, but just within the space there, particularly with COVID, what you're seeing is a sort of a return to people saying, you know what, as part of your mindfulness, as part of sort of your sort of supporting mental health, because people have been working from home, you know, there is an encouragement to kind of return, at least for people within the secular space, to return to some level of mindfulness and spirituality. And I've heard people even talk about, like, go back to your spirituality so that it gives you a little bit of ground. So it's quite an interesting trend where within the secular space where people are being encouraged. The organization itself may not, although they encourage mindfulness and they encourage yoga, they encourage all of those things, which has an element of spirituality in there, but they're not necessarily that they're encouraging the individuals to go. But you know, it's for faith-based organizations, I think the challenge is this tension, because if you seem to be spiritual, then people automatically assume you're going to proselytize, and that's the problem.
Thank you very much.
Can I just add on one thing to this, or you want to go? You can go.
I suppose maybe clarify. I found your responses super helpful. Maybe one of the things that I was thinking about is the way in which, for example, magical realism in Black feminist writing taps into a sense of something that is spiritual, something that is ethereal. And I just wondered if that way of thinking, like in Toni Morrison's work, or more recently in Ta-Nehisi Coates's work, comes through in faith and the centrality that faith can play in people's ideas of development with a small d. Be silent, because I think you've got lots and lots of comments and questions on the side as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kamna. Thank you. Manoj.
Yes, to add on to what Amjad was saying, not just from the perspective of the donors. If you look at India's situation, if you integrate, prayer and meditation, etc., within the faith-based organizations' faith and development agenda, there's a high risk of government intervention there, because especially Christian and Islamic organization embedding prayer and activities that looks religious, there is a high chance that they'll be criticized, or they'll be under the scanner for proselytism, and that's a major intimidation that the state can do, which is actually evidently the state has been doing over the past 1 decade. So I think that, like Amjad said, that there's a tension in involving and combining more spirituality and faith-based actions into development. So there's always a compulsion to remain some level of secularity in whatever they do. So it's just not from the donor's perspective, it is also from the state's perspective. I'm talking about this from India's perspective, context specific. Thank you.
Thanks, Manoj. We have a question or a hand up from Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. I just wanted to point out that there are a couple of questions in the chat, and maybe we could take these. So first of all, Susanna has shared some resources that might be interesting for people. So just in case you haven't seen it, there are a couple of links. And then there was one question for Zeb by Venkat, and one question for everyone by Rebecca.
Yeah, I'm happy to take the question from Venkat. Are there multiple Christian groups in Vietnam? If yes, might there be a difference in political outlook between evangelicals and the others? So yeah, in Vietnam, there's a large Catholic presence, around 8% of the population. That's been around for hundreds of years, much longer time period than the kind of Protestants. And yes, certainly, if you're talking about Catholics, then there will be different dynamics with regard to this, because they've had a much more first-hand role in the kind of Vietnamese colonial experience, with the French imperialist invasion. But then also, it's a much more long-standing tradition. So they get input from the Vatican on ideas about social justice and everything. So it's a different kettle of fish with Catholics altogether. But there's still very much a very critical view of the kind of atheist communist government. With regards to kind of Protestant Christians, there's not many groups around. There's only a few really. the government is very strict on giving out kind of official certificates to operate in the country, and not many people get them. So there's a much more limited spectrum of like different religious and also political perspectives within the Protestant presence. So there are differences in opinions of like between like more old school austere evangelicalism to more kind of charismatic / Pentecostal theology, Protestantism. So there's those kinds of difference. So they do play out differently, I suppose, or they should play out differently, I suppose, in like attitudes towards development, especially the whole prosperity theology thing, which I don't think I want to get into right now. But just coming back to what Nadine said, and slightly answering Kamna's question about the possibility of plurality. I think the good place to start is talking and having conversations, and that's why I think Nadine's onto a winner with her teaching. Don't mention the word decolonialism, but we'll get there eventually. And in the same in Vietnam, like when I talk to people, they're shocked that there are Christians who don't vote Republican. They just think that's the thing you do. If you're a Christian, you vote Republican and you're right wing. And so kind of bringing that kind of extra knowledge into, because you have to remember in Vietnam, not only is Christianity quite a new form, so it kind of hasn't had that opportunity to branch out as much over time, but also like information into the country has been restricted until quite recently. And so there's a kind of number of reasons why that information is not so widely available. So having those conversations, both within Christianity and between religious groups from the Vietnam experiences, is the best way to get towards a more kind of tolerant, if not pluralistic, approach to faith and development, I think.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks very much. So there was a comment from Susanna. Do you want to pick up on that, or is it evident enough from your comment in the chat?
I'm just trying to recall which one it was. Are you referring to
the Mothers Union, or an earlier one? Sorry, it's been coming so thick and fast from the
I think I'll let it rest just as a comment that people might wish to follow up. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Susanna. Cheers, thank you. And Rebecca, do you want to pose your question, which I think is marvellous and absolutely at the core of what we need to be thinking about?
Yeah, sure. I have my.
Hi there. Hi again. Nice to see you.
Yeah, thank you guys for such an interesting panel, and I've been here all 3 days, so it's really great to learn from everyone. But yeah, something I struggle with as a researcher now, as a graduate student, is the ethical question of, can I even do research in the Global South, and should I be doing this research? And yeah, so if you want to read my question, I'm curious on your thoughts, because most of you are academics. Yeah, what are your thoughts on decolonizing research, and how can we go about this? And can we decolonize development when most of the research is still coming from the Global North?
Fabulous question. Would anyone like to address that from their own perspective and experience?
Emma, I'll go ahead here because
cheers, Nadine, thank you.
In South Africa, so just to say, at my own university about 2 years ago, now these are white South Africans in South Africa who did research on, okay, so the terminology is complicated, but basically mixed race women. I would be that, right? So-called colored is the word that's also contentious, but we won't get into that. Nevertheless, women who are socioeconomically disadvantaged and also women of color. And it was a team of all white women, South African white women. And their result was that women of color like myself are cognitively deficient. Okay, based on their psychological testing, their psychometric testing. They are not psychologists, using a Western instrument which is best suited to Canada and the US. They were sports scientists. Now, this raised a huge issue within our university. I also became embroiled in this whole drama because I'm part of the transformation infrastructure in the university, and raised questions, Rebecca, like the one that you are asking here. And by the way, my own faculty currently, we're also sitting with the interesting incident where, oh, well, this is being recorded, but basically, there is a case where someone is doing a culturally sensitive topic and is a person of color, but is being supervised by only white colleagues who don't have an inside view of that particular culture. So these are some of the complexities. I don't think there's one answer to it. I'm using examples. And my third example is that I have a white South African student, older woman in her 50s, doing research in a Black township in South Africa, an FBO. And this is one of the things that we've discussed at length. And one of the things that she's chosen to do is be very clear about her positionality, who she is, where she comes from, what possible blind spots she may have, the fact that she may not even be able to identify some of those blind spots adequately. And then I think also to work very closely in her research with practitioners that are based in the context. And I've also encouraged her to be she's doing her research analysis and data analysis rather. And I've been very, very clear about how do you talk about the poor? When you talk about disadvantage or poverty, by what are your perspectives on that informed? Because you bring that to your data analysis. And even as supervisor of color, I have blind spots when it comes to Black township culture. So I also have blind spots as a supervisor there. So I mean, it's complex. There's not one answer to it. I think that my other colleagues would say, some of my Black colleagues would say, no, it's not a case of white people or European people can't study Africa or other cultures, but it is about reflexivity, positionality, being open about the power dynamics in your research, even documenting those perhaps, because all of that affects the way that you do research and sometimes even the results of the research.
Can I maybe come to add on to, I think Nadine is spot on. I mean, so Rebecca, I'm going to kind of probably give you from how we within the humanitarian sector will come into, because there's similar conversations, right? How do we come in and sort of look at supporting if there's an emergency or whatever? And I think spot on. I think it's just being more, first of all, is having that awareness and that mind. You are aware of your blind spots and you are aware of coming in with, I mean, no, not with any answers at all, or with some answers, because often what we do is we come in already with a preconceived notion, and I think it's very important not to do that. And then, of course, then to have that opportunity to speak with people on the ground, first and foremost, get that insight, have that humility to sort of say we don't know everything, and so what is it that we can do? I think language is also very important. The words that you use, within the humanitarian sector, this concept of having the beneficiary or whatever, those are not words that you would use, right? So you would have to kind of look at something else like affected community or whatever. I mean, even the images that we use sometimes, right? I mean, there's often, and I was struck, and I've been struck with how we've covered COVID, the second wave of COVID, in Europe versus in places like India and Sri Lanka and places like that, where we've, if you've looked at how we've covered COVID from India, we've gone into the emergency rooms and showcased people in the emergency rooms struggling with oxygen and everything else. We would never have done that if it was in the UK or the US or whatever. These are subtle ways of how we perpetuate this opportunity. You can't get away from the system, otherwise you have to talk about a whole system change. I mean, that's probably not where, I mean, that's like it's the new world order in terms of how we do education, right? I think that's something else. But I think it's just from a very practical perspective is doing that and giving that agency for people that you're working with on the ground to be able to contribute to that. I also heard sometimes, like, we have to do all these due diligence on our partners on the field. They should also do it on us. I mean, that's something that we can sort of look at. So I would sort of say, I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but it's really sort of that more practical way of sort of how you are much more mindful in how you engage.
Excellent, thanks, Amjad. We have a hand up from Jennifer, so I'll come to you first, and then Manoj, I'll come to you.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. I do agree with what Nadine and Amjad said, especially the points that Nadine made about positionality and reflexivity and language, and what she said about that there's not one straightforward answer. So I think because, as Amjad said, you can't change the system. You're part of the system, and that's a fact, right? I think two more points that I feel are important in this context, and I'm speaking as a Muslim with a background in conflict and terrorism studies, which is dominated by white non-Muslim men who explain to the rest of the world what Muslims are like. So that's my that's a perspective that I started looking at these questions from, and I feel a really important question to ask yourself as a researcher in this context is also who benefits from your research. And I'm frankly quite fed up by researchers who are not part of a community, and their research really only benefits themselves and their career. I can't see it anymore, and I see it so often. I'm sick of it. And it's so easy, actually, to avoid this. It's so easy to develop relationships with the groups or the communities that you do the research with. It's so easy to just, really develop these relationships and make sure that there is something in it also for the people who participate in your research. The other thing I think that can also be very easily done is that you ask yourself what kind of white academic you want to be, right? And you can be the white academic who then works with research assistants from the country that you're doing the research in, but you don't co-author with them, right? Or you don't help them get opportunities that you might be aware of, and maybe they're not. So you basically don't help them also benefit, and you can be the white academic who sits on yet another all white panel, right? And it's very easily done, right? You can just say, no, I don't do that. I won't sit on an all white panel. And you can say, I won't sit on a panel. Did you say your research was in Kenya? So you can very easily say, I'm not gonna participate in an edited volume or an event where that is about Kenya, but there's not a single Kenyan included. So again, it doesn't take much effort. It's really just a matter of being aware of it and then sticking to your principles, even if sometimes it means that you yourself will lose out on opportunities. But then I'd rather do that than violate my values and my principles.
Sorry, thanks, Jennifer. Busy making notes there. Thanks very much. No, some really helpful pointers there, Jennifer. Thank you. Manoj.
Yes, I just had to add one point to what all of them are saying. It's about positionality. It is about reflexivity, and it's also a question that I face for myself. It's a moral ethical question that I am also entangled with, whether someone from the global south itself can study another experience that I'm not personally familiar with. For example, if I'm studying a group, if I'm studying working with a marginal community which I'm not part of, so it is not about the south north. It is also about your own positionality and reflexivity. So I think it's a question of being aware of one's own position and what motivates you to look into the thing that you are doing. It's a question that doesn't have an answer, I felt, and it's also a question that everybody is in bank. It's not just about whether one from the north can study the south. So, yeah, just a thought. Thank you.
No, I mean, that's just such a good reminder that inequalities are not just between north and south, that they exist everywhere within all communities. So thanks for that reminder, Manoj. Any more points or comments, questions, feedback?
I just wanted to pick up. I mean, and it's reminded me. Nadine's point has reminded me of this concept of the space between the scholars of the text and the scholars of the context, right? And this aspect of having that conversation in a way that really addresses some of these things. And I think that there is something there that we really haven't sort of brought forth, is how do we bring those two together? We don't talk about decolonization in the courses that Nadine is talking about, but we're trying to push them towards sort of having a better understanding of that. And I think it is that because ultimately, from a very specific perspective, if we are really to get through to communities that are on the ground, and I think this idea of the scholars of the text and scholars of the context, I think it's something there that I would love to kind of see how that is unpacked. And then, I mean, I think I sort of mentioned it early in my introduction, but I think that the conversations around decolonization currently should not. It's not just about the past, right? It is about present systems of oppression and injustice. We're seeing occupation in many parts of the world. We're seeing many conflicts that are there, and I think it's important that we don't lose sight of that, because and again, many of those conflicts and those oppressions and those colonial occupations at the moment can be tangled up within faith conversations, and that also has its own tensions. And so I think it's important that once we look at the past, we also focus on the present and sort of see how that is there, because I have a feeling we shouldn't lose sight of that. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you, Amjad. So we've probably got enough time left for one question. I think we'll be cut off at 1:45. So we do have time for some more discussion, a few more minutes.
Manoj, do you still have your hand up, or is that from before? From before?
I'm done. That was done before.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry.
No problem.
I mean, if there are no more questions or comments, we could also just because we haven't spoken a lot about. I think, Emma, you mentioned at the beginning that these discussions, obviously over the last 3 years, 3 days.
Not like 3 years.
It's like 3 years. And not just 3 days, because
when you're having fun.
I'm ready for lunch, Deb. I'm ready for lunch. No, it's not even just 3 days, because we really started the discussion on Friday in the study group meeting, right? So it's really been 4 days of discussion and engagement. And I think Emma mentioned in the beginning that like all of us, we have been really we felt really stimulated, and we've had lots of ideas and about what to do next, and we are working on these, and we will be working on these. We'll be in touch with all of you to see if you would like to be involved in some of them. But then there's obviously also the link to the work of the JLI, the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities, for those who don't know it. and let me just quickly put the link in the chat, because these roundtables, they're part of the DSA Religions and Development Study Group that Emma and I co-convene. But I also work for the JLI, and Emma is a board member. So they're also very much, have been very much influenced by the debates we have been having at JLI. And quite a few of our panelists actually are also JLI board members, or JLI general members and friends. Yeah, so we should probably mention the Fair and Equitable initiative of the JLI in this context. And for those of you who don't know about it yet, do keep an eye on it. I'll put a link in the chat again in a minute, because we will be continuing this work around questions of decolonization, development, and faith for the next 2 years with the JLI. So this might also be something that people may want to know more about, or maybe even get involved in. So I just put the link in the chat.
Thanks so much for organizing and hosting and chairing everything, Jennifer and Emma. It's been great.
Thank you, and thanks for your participation, and to all the panelists today. I mean, it's just been amazing. And yeah, as we've been speaking, myself and Jennifer have been sort of swapping notes about let's do something with this. So we have a couple of ideas, and we'll be in touch with everyone. So don't forget what you've been talking about. So we'll be in touch soon. So thank you so much, and thanks to the audience as well. It's been a really wonderful set of three panels.